Доброго дня.
Good morning, guests, viewers. Here, offline and online, the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center is starting its work today. And the first event is a report of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine about the human rights situation in Ukraine. We'll have Matilda Bogner, head of the mission, to report about that. So please, the floor is yours.
And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, I would like to welcome those present here today and those joining us online. Today we are launching our 32nd report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, which covers the period from the 1st of February to the 31st of July 2021. The findings we present are based on information gathered during 92 field visits, 12 visits to places of detention, 82 court hearings, 75 assemblies, and 1,156 interviews with victims, witnesses of human rights violations, as well as other sources of information. The security situation in eastern Ukraine has deteriorated, with an increase in civilian casualties resulting from active hostilities and damage to civilian objects. From the 1st of February to the 31st of July, OHCHR has recorded 62 civilian casualties, 15 killed and 47 injured. This is a 51% increase compared with the preceding 6 months. This trend is continuing with 16 civilian casualties, 2 killed and 14 injured, caused by active hostilities in August and the first 20 days of September, the highest monthly figures since June 2020. Our civilian casualty records clearly demonstrate that the 27th of July 2020 ceasefire resulted in a 6-fold decrease in civilian casualties caused by active hostilities when comparing the 12 months before the ceasefire to the 12 months after. It shows that it is possible to put in place an effective ceasefire that protects civilian lives. If it has been done once, it can be done again. The most effective way to protect civilians is to stop the shooting. COVID-19 freedom of movement restrictions continued to place a heavy burden on civilians who need to cross the contact line. From the 1st of February to the 31st of July, the number of crossings of the contact line in both directions decreased by 95% compared to the same pre-pandemic period in 2019. Older persons, and specifically older women, who were the majority of those crossing before the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, have been particularly affected. Restrictions imposed by armed groups of self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, in particular, have forced many people to cross from territory controlled by armed groups to government-controlled territory via the Russian Federation. The adoption and enactment of a law in July releasing civilians who have crossed this border on humanitarian grounds from administrative penalties is a positive step by the government of Ukraine. During our visits to settlements located on both sides of the contact line, residents expressed their frustration about access to water and sanitation, healthcare, lack of government services, public transport, and passable roads. Often they're not able to see family members due to COVID-19 restrictions and military checkpoints. For example, in the village of Nova Alexandrovka in government-controlled territory, residents told OHCHR that they are forced to walk 3 kilometers through potentially mined unpaved paths and fields to access pensions, food, transport, and government services in a nearby town. Village residents have not had access to electricity since 2014. In territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, OHCHR is concerned by the April adoption of a regulation that allows for expropriation of immovable property, considered abandoned or left unclaimed. OHCHR is following this development as it not only risks violating housing rights of internally displaced persons, but may also endanger future restitution and create additional constraints for the return and reintegration of internally displaced persons. In March and April this year, both self-proclaimed republics issued so-called decrees establishing the forced recruitment of 400 men into armed groups. Such forced recruitment exposes young male civilians to involuntary lethal danger, stripping them of the protection afforded to civilians by international humanitarian law. It also burdens them with an undue risk of criminal prosecution. We're also concerned about violations of the prohibition on discrimination raised by allegations that workers in territory controlled by self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic have been threatened with salary reduction or dismissal if they did not obtain Russian citizenship. Regarding the draft law on the transitional period recently registered in Parliament, while it has some welcome provisions, we are worried, among other things, that it is built around a definition of transitional justice that is not in line with international standards and does not ensure a victim-centred approach. Turning now to the right to liberty and security of persons, I would like to note a positive development since the cut-off date of the report. On the 5th of August, OHCHR was granted confidential access to 2 men and 2 women in the Lugansk CISO. We welcome this development and hope that we will have continued access to detainees there. We are also seeking such access in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. During the reporting period, in territory controlled by armed groups, OHCHR documented 13 cases of conflict-related arbitrary detention, 11 of whom remain in detention. In one case, a woman was held incommunicado for 22 days at a temporary detention facility. She was released in May. However, she was banned from entering territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic for 5 years and threatened with further detention if she attempted to return. In relation to domestic violence in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics, we found that there was insufficient support and resources to protect victims, usually women and their children. Very few organisations were able to operate shelters or provide other services to victims of domestic violence. The self-proclaimed republics do not allow funding from international organisations to finance services or shelters for domestic violence survivors in territory they control. At least one activist was threatened with detention if she accepted such funding. In government-controlled territory, we documented 3 cases of detention of individuals believed to be linked or affiliated with self-proclaimed republics, where there were violations such as excessive use of force during arrest. OHCHR also continues to follow the investigation into allegations of torture and ill treatment in the Alexievska penal colony number 25 in Kharkiv. We are concerned about further allegations of retaliation against prisoners, apparently for their earlier complaints of torture. In the context of the administration of justice in government-controlled territory, violations of the rights to fair trial and liberty in conflict-related cases, criminal cases, continued through the unlawful application of in flagranti arrests without court warrants and the denial of prompt access to legal aid. We welcome the adoption on the 20th of May this year of a law harmonising domestic criminal law with international criminal law, which significantly expands the definitions of international crimes in line with the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. However, as of the 20th of September, we are concerned that the law has not been signed by the President and so has not yet come into force. It would be a significant missed opportunity not to take this final step to ensure accountability for perpetrators for international crimes. Some progress has been made in the prosecution of perpetrators of violations in relation to the Maidan protests. This is particularly due to the amendments to the Criminal Procedure Code on the 27th of April, which enable in absentia prosecution of some individuals who are at large. OHCHR welcomes progress in bringing to account members of Titushky groups for crimes against Mr. Lutsenko and Mr. Verbitsky. However, the lack of tangible progress in investigations and trials in relation to the killings and violent deaths on the 2nd of May 2014 in Odessa remains a matter of concern. In light of the numerous individual complaints that we have received over the years, we welcome the recent decision of the Constitutional Court on the 16th of September declaring unconstitutional provisions of the criminal law that have prevented people sentenced to life imprisonment from being paroled or having their sentences commuted. We urge the Parliament to promptly respond to the Constitutional Court decision while taking into account the case law of the UN Human Rights Committee, the European Court of Human Rights, and recommendations of international partners prior to the adoption of the pertinent draft laws 4048 and 4049. Regarding civic space and fundamental freedoms in government-controlled territory over the reporting period, we have documented 22 cases of threats and attacks against journalists and other media workers, human rights defenders, LGBTI people or their supporters, and members of national minorities. There were also 2 cases of violence related to tensions between Orthodox religious communities. This includes 5 cases of violent attacks, threats, and acts of intimidation by unidentified individuals against 3 men and 1 woman working on environmental issues in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa, and 1 man and 1 woman working on corruption issues in Dnipro and Rubizhny. The woman was forced to seek medical treatment in hospital after being brutally beaten. Our office also documented that the authorities disregarded the bias motives of perpetrators when investigating 3 attacks on LGBTI persons by groups that promote violence. 21 hate speech incidents were documented during the reporting period, 6 directed against Roma, another 6 against LGBTI persons. 4 targeted women, another 4 targeted people perceived to have pro-Russian views, and 1 targeted people with disabilities. As was widely reported, the National Council for Security and Defence decided, with the endorsement of the President, to apply sanctions, which resulted in the closure of the television channels 112 Ukraine, Zik, and News 1. On the 20th of August, the National Council for Security and Defence issued another decision imposing further sanctions which have led to restrictions on access to online media outlets. OHCHR is concerned that these decisions are not in line with international standards on the right to freedom of expression, as they were not taken by an independent authority and they failed to demonstrate the necessity and proportionality of these restrictions. OHCHR will continue to follow the situation. In territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics, the atmosphere of fear and self-censorship prevailed. However, despite the existing risks, several assemblies critical of the so-called authorities were held, including protests by coal miners against salary delays and at least 1 rally by local residents against lack of water supply. That said, OHCHR is not aware of assemblies being held on more sensitive topics. The self-proclaimed republics also continued to act against several evangelical Christian denominations. For example, on the 25th of June, the so-called Prosecution requested the so-called arbitration court of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, to ban activities of the Church of Evangelical Christian Baptists, Probuzhdenie. Our office continued to monitor the situation of economic and social rights. The lack of social housing and social services to address the needs of homeless people throughout the country is concerning. 5 regions of Ukraine have no shelters. In addition, the shelter in Mykolaiv still accepts only men, which significantly limits access of homeless women to shelter, water, and hygiene. Homeless persons without identification papers also face difficulties accessing healthcare services. Our monitoring shows that persons with disabilities are also at risk of homelessness when they are discharged from hospitals and long-term care facilities. For example, 3 men with disabilities were found in a cemetery after a hospital car reportedly brought them there. Although they were then admitted to a municipal shelter for homeless people, it was not adequately equipped to provide accommodation and care for people with disabilities, and could only accept them on a temporary basis. Persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities in long-term care facilities faced a number of difficulties, such as lack of access to adequate medical care and contact with the outside world. Some women living in such facilities alleged that they had been compelled to accept injections of hormonal contraception. OHCHR is further concerned about the negative impact of legislative amendments introduced in April this year, which tightened the eligibility criteria for receiving housing subsidies to pay for utilities. This has disproportionately affected persons and groups in situations of vulnerability, such as Roma, people living in rural and conflict-affected areas, persons with disabilities, and in particular, women from these groups. In the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, occupied by the Russian Federation, we continued to document violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law, and to make recommendations to remedy these to the Russian Federation as the occupying power. The Russian Federation's blanket requirement of pre-authorization for public assemblies restricts freedom of peaceful assembly on the peninsula. Peaceful protests against the Russian government by supporters of detained Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny led to arrests during the protests and in the following weeks. Crimean Tatars were also affected by the blanket restrictions when law enforcement agencies issued warnings in advance of commemorative dates that they celebrate. Crimean Tatars continued to be targeted beyond the reporting period. 5 Crimean Tatar men were arrested in Crimea on the 3rd and 4th of September, following searches conducted in their homes by Russian law enforcement bodies. They were held incommunicado and denied access to lawyers. One of them, Nariman Jelail, is the deputy head of the Mejlis and representative body of the Crimean Tatar community. Together with another 2 men, he was accused of sabotage and remanded in custody. The remaining 2 men were charged with an administrative offence and sentenced to 14 and 15 days in detention, respectively. 58 people who had gathered peacefully in support of the men were arrested and subjected to administrative sanctions. Cases of torture and ill treatment against Ukrainian citizens in Crimea continued. In an emblematic case on the 10th of March, FSB officers detained journalist Vladislav Yesipenko on suspicion of illegal possession of explosives, following which he was tortured. Despite the victim's identification of the persons he alleges responsible for his torture, the investigative committee refused to launch a formal investigation until the decision was quashed by the prosecutor's office in April. As of the 22nd of September, the investigation has still not been launched. Fair trial rights also continued to be violated. In the case of Rifat Chubarov, the chairman of the Mejalis, currently living in mainland Ukraine, who was sentenced in absentia by the Supreme Court of Crimea to 6 years in prison for organising mass disturbances during a rally before the Crimean Parliament on the 26th of February 2014, following the retroactive application of legislation which is in violation to international standards. We recommend the government of, we recommend the government's adoption. We commend the government's adoption of the National Human Rights Strategy and Action Plan on the 23rd of June, which incorporated a number of recommendations made by the UN in Ukraine. In light of the current increase in civilian casualties and damages to civilian infrastructure, we call on all parties to the conflict to fully implement a ceasefire and thereby significantly reduce the impact of the hostilities on the civilian population. Looking forward, transitional justice can be a keystone to a peaceful and sustainable resolution of the conflict. The government should focus its efforts to ensure its transitional justice policies are fully compliant with international standards. In territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics, persisting grave violations of human rights must be immediately halted. Repression against those who express critical or independent views must stop, and fundamental freedoms respected. Survivors of domestic violence must be ensured access to services, including medical and psychosocial care, shelters, and socio-economic support. In Crimea, continuing violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law by the Russian Federation as the occupying power need to be addressed. We call on all duty bearers to implement our recommendations and stand ready to assist them in these efforts. Looking forward, we will be issuing an update on the human rights situation in Ukraine in early November and the next full report in March. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, dear journalists, do you have any questions to our presenter here? We have no questions. Then thank you very much indeed to everyone. Let's conclude.